Hello everybody. Today I want to talk about cartoon illustration, educational uses of comics, and how those come together. I was looking at my college alumni magazine this morning, and they interviewed students about their plans upon graduation, where they were going, what they were doing, and it was illustrated in that comic format. It was also a story about an eminent judge. Instead of a photograph, they used an illustration. Simple colors and values. Calls attention to what's important, the impact of the imagery more than a photograph can. And that's what comic and educational illustration can do. Will Eisner, who I mentioned did the comic strip The Spirit, he was one of the first to actually think about the medium and the potential of the medium to tell stories and analyze it the way McCloud, another professional comics artist, has done. So he did a book on comics and sequential art, but before that, he got contracts from the U.S. military to illustrate handbooks on how to maintain various machinery and trucks and follow protocol, which is necessary for any organization. And he had a successful studio getting contracts to do comics that explained things. About the same time, or a little before that, emigre from Europe, Rudolph Modley, got work during the Depression doing pictos, graphics that explain information, that are charts, that are graphs about labor and percentages of the labor force. And he used a very simplified human form. They call it the picto, almost like the little man or woman on the bathroom door. Very simple graphic that conveys the inspiration. Iconic graphics. When talking about humor magazines in the New Yorker, I mentioned Saul Steinberg and William Steig. And a lot of what they did in the magazine were just these strange little illustrations that created mood, crazy little faces of people you might see in the city, the big city, New York, different kinds. And he did these for many years. Look how influenced by Cubism he is. So it boils down to comics, boils down to comic illustration. When I was a kid, everybody's parents worrying that he's reading nothing but comic books made sure we knew about Classics Illustrated, great literature put in comics format. And at the end of each comic, it says, now that you've enjoyed the comic, be sure to read the book. But like Cliff Notes, it's a good introduction to a piece of literature. And it was fun to see them in comics form. As a little kid, I made sure I bought this about that new rock band from England. Later on, you started having political comics appearing. Here was one from the 70s about Nelson Rockefeller and the Incredible Rocky, the New York politician. He was vice president for a while, but about the scope of his involvement in business and politics globally. That attitude of serious content being delivered in comic form carried over into England, and a publishing collective called Writers and Readers started producing books. The For Beginners series. Here's Freud for Beginners, illustrated by Oscar Zarate, I believe, Latin American. Uh, yeah, Oscar Zarate, did Freud for Beginners. And Marx for Beginners by a Mexican cartoonist, Rios, was the first in the series. But it was quite a long-running series, and it was one Elvis for Beginners, with illustrations by Wayne White. That was a good one. There was a rival publisher, Totem Books, introducing the series. Robert Crumb, who we'll talk about in the underground comics movement, he illustrated one a few years ago, Kafka for Beginners, about the writer Franz Kafka, the early 20th century novelist in Eastern Europe. And that, I think, inspired him to do a larger work, the Book of Genesis. And so there's a version of the Book of Genesis illustrated by Robert Crumb, the cartoonist. That got notice. Here's one of the introducing series. They made them smaller and called them graphic guides about the philosopher Zizek. And the fun ink work in there, nice distortions of the caricatures of these notable intellectuals, makes for a good read. Now, there's a religious publisher, Jack Chick, out of Southern California. And for many years, he's been producing and distributing these small religious tracts. The Curse of Baphomet, A Demon's Nightmare, The Death Cookie, and by that he means the host in Catholic communion. He's very critical of the Catholic Church. But these are, they often have what's called an O. Henry ending, that surprise ending, a twist. Somebody discovers that the guy who's been leading the party and showing them such a good time pulls off his mask, and he's really Satan, and the partier is doomed to hell. So, very vivid religious lessons, evangelist Christianity delivered in comic format. And you may be able to find these still at Christian bookstores. Sometimes you find that sometimes people will buy them and distribute them, leave them around free because they want you to attend their church. And so they're well done in terms of delivering the message Jack Chick wants to deliver in powerful comics form. There started to be a study of comics that Eisner may be one of the first to really analyze it, and of course Scott McCloud, but you started to get more appreciation, even academic appreciation of comics. Comic museums starting, a very notable one in France that honors artists from around the world every year at Angoulême, but there's one in San Francisco. I got to meet the cartoonist for Peanuts, who was a supporter of it there shortly before he died. They exist, and there are also schools of comic art. One up in Vermont, and one in the New York area and elsewhere. So there are opportunities for further study, but also academic and analysis of comics. Um, this book came out in the 70s in South America, and it was analyzing American Donald Duck comics as carriers of American foreign policy in Latin America. So it was quite critical, but then translated into English. More recently, you've had academic publications like this one, the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, that people from universities analyze the comics. We have people in our university who are delivering papers on comics and so on as well. So I'm not the only one reading comics around here. Last of all, if you want to pursue uh, cartoon illustration in any form, I strongly suggest you read up on it, collect books on it. I hope this class gives you excuses to go into bookstores and used bookstores the rest of your life to see what you can find. This book, I believe, is still in print by a longtime Mad magazine editor, Nick Meglin, on humorous illustration. Includes a lot of interviews with both longtime Mad staffers, but also well-known cartoonists, illustrators. The filmmaker Fellini, who was very much influenced by comics, gives the foreword. And you see an appreciation of caricature in comics that runs through all his movies. So, what I want you to know is people are getting paid for doing that kind of artwork. And if that's your kind of artwork, I strongly urge you to pursue it. I got hired as a senior graphic designer at Apple Computer because they basically wanted me to do comic illustration. Now, long ago and far away, the computer industry had hardware that was so limited, you needed to be able to work very simply because the graphics just couldn't be very complicated. And that is the skills that a comics artist brings to the table. Simplification, distillation of an idea, somebody else's idea, down to iconic, simple, readable images. And that's what I want you to learn.